The banners of the Galactic Empire hung from every rooftop, their sigils embossed in gleaming silver against a field of deep crimson. The execution platform stood at the heart of Terra 4's main square, an elevated slab of black metal, cold and unfeeling. A hush fell over the gathered crowd, an eerie silence in a city that once thrived with the sounds of human life. Now, all that remained was fear. Daniel Carter stood at the center of it all, wrists bound in iron cuffs, his face streaked with dried blood and dirt. He was young, too young for this. 17, barely a man. His breathing was ragged, but he held his head high. The Drakthal, towering reptilian overlords of the Galactic Empire, had declared him a traitor, an insurgent, an enemy of order. The truth was simpler. He had been a boy who dared to dream of freedom. High Commander Vrockzor loomed beside him, his scaled armor glistening under the artificial lights. He was an imposing figure, his yellow eyes cold, unreadable. He stepped forward, addressing the silent masses. This human whelp conspired against the Empire, his voice rasped, amplified by the speakers lining the square. Let his death be a lesson to those who cling to their primitive defiance. The crowd stirred, but no one spoke. Fear was a weight pressing down on them all. Some turned their eyes away. Others clenched their fists, but remained motionless. The penalty for dissent was clear. Daniel inhaled deeply, his gaze sweeping over the faces before him. He searched for something, maybe a last sign of hope, maybe a familiar face, but found only resignation. The humans of Terra 4 had been broken long before today. The execution was merely the final punctuation to an unspoken truth. The Empire had won. But Daniel knew better. A small smirk flickered at the corner of his lips. The defiance in his expression made the executioner hesitate for the briefest moment. Vrockzor narrowed his eyes, stepping closer, his clawed fingers tapping against the hilt of his ceremonial blade. You find amusement in this, human. Daniel met the alien's gaze without flinching. You have no idea what you've done. Vrockzor sneered. I have extinguished a spark before it could become a flame. Daniel's smirk widened, a whisper of something dark, something inevitable. No, you just threw a torch into an oil field. There was no time for Vrockzor to respond. The signal was given, and the executioner pulled the lever. The trapdoor beneath Daniel's feet vanished. For a split second, weightlessness. Then the rope snapped taut. A sickening silence filled the square. The body swayed, a grotesque pendulum against the blood-red banners of the Empire. Somewhere in the crowd, a woman stifled a sob. A child buried his face into his mother's side. The Drakthal stood motionless, satisfied. To them, this was justice, a display of power, another lesson etched into the bones of an oppressed world. Vrockzor turned on his heel, already bored. Leave the corpse for 24 hours. Let them remember what defiance costs. The guards dispersed, their boots thudding against the stone. The execution was over, but the war was just beginning. The transmission played in silence, but John Carter heard everything. The image flickered, distorted by interference. Yet the scene remained unmistakable. Daniel, standing on that execution platform, his face bloodied but unbroken. John watched as his son lifted his chin, as the noose was tightened around his neck, as his final words slipped from his lips. Then the floor dropped. The screen darkened. The recording ended. John sat still, his breath slow, measured, controlled in a way that only years of discipline had taught him. But the stillness was a deception. Beneath it, something ruptured. A fault line deep in his chest cracked, and from it poured something vast and black and endless. He had known war, had seen men die with his own hand steady on the trigger, had buried comrades in foreign soil, but nothing had ever felt like this. He exhaled through his nose. The old instinct stirred, a beast long cage rattling against its bars. A storm raged beyond the walls of his hidden outpost, winds howling over the dead landscape of Terra 7, a barren moon where he had spent the last decade as a ghost. It was safer that way. The Empire had won, and men like him, Men who had once been weapons had no place in the galaxy anymore. He had thought he could live with that. He had been wrong. He reached for the holodeable, fingers ghosting over the edges of the screen. A single command brought the image of Daniel back, frozen at the moment just before the drop. 17 years old, too young to die, too young to fight a war alone. John closed his eyes, but the darkness behind his lids was worse. Memories surged. A boy no older than 6, standing on unsteady feet, cradling a rifle too big for his hands. "Like this?" Daniel had asked, his voice filled with the kind of excitement only a child could have. John had smiled then, knelt beside him, adjusted his grip. "Like that, but steady your breath. Always steady your breath." The rifle sat in the corner now, gathering dust. His rifle, the one he had used in wars long buried under propaganda and time. He had once been the Empire's worst nightmare. A ghost in the trees, a bullet from nowhere. The sniper they could never catch, never kill. He was older now. Slower, maybe, but he had not forgotten. His fingers curled into fists. The storm outside had nothing on the one inside him. The grief was a fire, but it did not consume. It refined, hammered his sorrow into something sharp, something deadly. The Empire had made a mistake. They had taken his son. They had left his body hanging like a warning. But they had forgotten the most important rule of war. Snipers don't announce themselves. They don't come with banners and armies. They don't fight wars in the open. They wait. They watch. And when the moment is right, they kill. John stood, the decision already made, as inevitable as the next sunrise. His hand found the rifle, fingers wrapping around the familiar weight of it. He slung it over his shoulder, stepped toward the control panel, and accessed the encrypted frequencies he hadn't touched in years. The old contacts were still out there. Resistance fighters, smugglers, men who owed him favors. He would find them. He would find the ones responsible. And then, one by one, he would make them pay. The first shot was quiet. A whisper of death carried on the wind. The Drakthal officer stood atop the command tower, surveying the streets below, oblivious to the thin beam of light cutting through the night. He never heard the shot, never felt the impact, never realized his life had ended before his body even collapsed. One moment, he was barking orders to the patrols below. The next, his skull was a ruined mess of green and black ichor, and his body crumpled over the railing like a discarded puppet. From a quarter-mile away, John Carter lowered his rifle. The air smelled of rain and metal. The city beneath him a sprawl of steel and neon. Terrafor had changed since he last walked its streets, but occupation had a way of making everything feel the same. Too many soldiers, too few free men. He had spent the last 2 weeks tracking them, learning their patterns, watching them move through the ruins of what was once humanity's proudest colony. He hadn't rushed. Patience was the first lesson of a sniper. The second was knowing when to pull the trigger. Vroxor was still out of reach, hidden deep within the Imperial stronghold at the city's center, but his officers were everywhere. They strutted through the streets, confident, untouchable, arrogant enough to believe the execution of a single boy had ended the fight. John would teach them otherwise. He dismantled his rifle with practiced ease, slipping through the shadows of the old district. The Empire had left parts of the city to rot, entire blocks abandoned, except for patrols that never expected anything worse than a starving scavenger. John moved like a phantom between the ruins, stepping over broken glass and avoiding the glow of surveillance drones. The old skills were still there, buried beneath the years of self-imposed exile. It hadn't taken long to uncover names. Officers, enforcers, executioners, the men who had dragged Daniel through the streets, the ones who had looped the rope around his neck and kicked the platform from beneath him. They all had names, and John had written them down one by one. Tonight had been the first. The next would follow soon. By the time the body was discovered, he was already miles away, tucked into one of the Resistance's old safe houses. The rebels had been hesitant at first, wary of a lone man emerging from nowhere, promising vengeance. But whispers spread quickly in the underworld. The first kill had sent a message. The name Carter still carried weight. A contact had left a data chip at the meeting point, the coordinates leading him to a cantina at the city's outskirts. It was the kind of place where men spoke in hushed tones, where deals were struck in dark corners, and where loyalty was a currency worth more than credits. John slipped inside, scanning the room. A handful of humans, a few aliens from fringe worlds, drinking quietly. And near the back, a woman watching him with calculating eyes. She looked older than he remembered. More scars. The years had not been kind, but they had not broken her. "Thought you were dead," she said, lifting her glass in mock salute. "Not yet," John replied. Nia Vargas had been a resistance leader once, before the Empire crushed the last organized human rebellion. He had fought alongside her in the early days, before he walked away from it all, before he chose exile over another war he couldn't win. Now, war had come to him. "You put a lot of eyes on yourself," she said, lowering her voice. "Killing an officer in the middle of the city? That's not exactly subtle." "I'm not here to be subtle." She studied him for a long moment, then exhaled. "We always wondered what would bring you back." John didn't answer. She already knew. She slid a small device across the table. "We have movement on Vroxor. The bastard tightened security after your stunt. They're moving him in 3 days, heading off-world." "Where?" "Command ship. If he gets off-planet, you'll never reach him." John pocketed the device and stood. He had 3 days. Plenty of time. The wind howled through the steel corridors of the spaceport, carrying the acrid scent of fuel and ozone. The command shuttle sat at the center of the landing platform, its hull gleaming under floodlights, flanked by an entire regiment of Drakthal guards. They were armored, disciplined, weapons ready. They thought themselves untouchable. John Carter had other ideas. From his perch high above, hidden among the skeletal remains of an unfinished observation tower, he steadied his rifle. The scope flickered to life, scanning the crowd below. Vroxor stood at the base of the shuttle's ramp, his imposing form surrounded by officers barking final orders. The warlord's thick, scaled hide gleamed under the artificial lights, his ceremonial blade strapped to his hip, a relic of his many conquests. He looked at ease, confident in his security, oblivious to the unseen predator watching from the dark. John exhaled. He adjusted his sights, feeling the rifle settle into the crook of his shoulder, the weight familiar grounding. A shot at this distance with this wind? Difficult, but not impossible. He had made worse. The rifle kicked against him as he pulled the trigger. A heartbeat later, the first Drakthal officer dropped, half his head gone in a spray of black ichor. The square erupted into chaos. Soldiers turned in all directions, searching for the threat, but the second shot had already fired. Another officer collapsed, his body hitting the ground before anyone could react. Panic swept through the ranks. Vroxor roared orders, his voice barely cutting through the din, but it was already too late. Explosions tore through the perimeter as the resistance launched their strike. Hidden charges beneath transport vehicles detonated in rapid succession, sending fire and shrapnel through enemy lines. The first wave of human fighters surged from the shadows, their weapons rattling in the night. John kept firing. Each shot found its mark, an officer, a gunner, a fleeing commander. He wasn't just killing soldiers. He was dismantling their leadership, carving out the Empire's brain one well-placed bullet at a time. Vroxor moved fast, drawing his blade and cutting through 2 resistance fighters who had dared to rush him. He was powerful, brutal, more beast than general in the thick of battle. But John had never intended to fight him head-on. Another explosion rocked the platform, sending the Drakthal leader staggering back toward his shuttle. His remaining guards closed ranks, dragging him toward the ramp, desperate to escape. John adjusted his aim. He had 1 shot. The crosshairs settled just below Vroxor's throat. He pulled the trigger. The round hit like a hammer, punching through the alien's thick hide, tearing through bone. Vrockzor stumbled, dropped his blade, clutched at the gaping wound in his neck as his eyes bulged with disbelief. He tried to step forward, but his legs failed him. His body hit the ground with a dull thud. The mighty warlord of the Drakthal reduced to nothing more than a lifeless heap on a blood-stained floor. The remaining soldiers hesitated. Their leader was dead, their command structure shattered. And then, as if some invisible tether snapped, they broke. Some ran, some dropped their weapons, some fell to their knees, surrendering to the resistance fighters, now closing in. The battle was over. John watched from the tower, his rifle cooling in his hands. His job was done. He didn't wait for celebrations. He didn't stay to hear his name whispered in awe. He had never fought for glory, only justice. And justice had been delivered. By the time the sun rose over the smoldering ruins of the spaceport, John Carter was already gone.